Everybody, thanks for joining us on our last Wednesday lunchtime of the calendar year. So we're the Culture and Creativity Policy Network. Dan, Ashton and I on the call. We founded this network at the start of the year, based at the University of Southampton. We're interested in cultural policy and we're interested in creative approaches to policy. And that's the driving mission. This is our fourth dialogue sessions. This has been a kind of series of events whereby we've had speakers, some internal, I think mostly external actually for this, who have come in with specific expertise to talk about cultural policy issues. We've run these sessions alongside a review session, which has been more of a reading group style exercise. But this is where we have a speaker come in, talk about their work, and then open conversation up for discussion. And I'm super grateful today to have, first of all, Dimitra, a colleague in the Winchester School of Art at the University of Southampton chair today. So I'll be passing over in a minute, but even more grateful for Alice Borchi from Leeds to come and talk to us today about cultural commons and why are we talking about the cultural commons. So yeah, I'm not going to go on any further. Should I pass on to you, Dimitra, to introduce Alice?
Yes, I don't want to take much time, but I also share the excitement, especially because Alice has done extensive research on cultural commons, commoning practices in arts and culture, which I think it's an area that deserves more attention, more research, more funding, and so on. So Alice is a lecturer in creative industries at Leeds University, and her research focus on cultural commons, cultural value, with a focus on participatory practices and shared governance in cultural policy and management. And I think in today's talk, she will present part of your forthcoming monograph, which I look forward to reading, exploring in a way the trajectory of the commons, the evolution as well of the concept of cultural commons. And I think it's going to be a useful reflection and resource to see how the ideas and ideals and practices of the commons have become, in a way, more emergent in policy and cultural practices. So I will hand over to you, Alice, and I look forward to a Q&A and the conversation at the end.
Thank you so much for having me today, and thank you so much, Dimitra, for your lovely words. So, as Dimitra was saying, yes, this is a chapter of a book that is currently in the second round of reviews. So keep me in your prayers this Christmas, and I hope that everything goes well with that second round. And so I approach the theme of the cultural commons from quite a specific perspective, which is the perspective of cultural policy studies, which is my background. Now, as I started this book, I wanted to get an idea of what sorts of lessons we can learn from the concept of cultural commons and cultural commons practices in relation to policy, which is not a very easy question to answer, because the very relationship between the commons and governmental initiatives, policy, the state, is quite a controversial one. But before I set out to look more in depth about this, I needed to answer one question, which is why? Why do we have this concept of cultural commons? Where is it coming from? Why is it relevant for the cultural practices? So when I talk about the cultural commons, I'm talking about a very wide range of different practices and ways of thinking about culture that comes from a very wide interdisciplinary field. And interrelated in this concept, there are the questions of what property, human behavior, and governance. How do we think about these three things coming together? And it is, when we talk about the commons, we're thinking about the big questions, really, about big global problems. How do we solve things together? How do we give each other rules to follow and behave ethically with each other and to reach our common shared goals? But also within the cultural commons, there are questions that are related to cultural value. So why is culture important to us? And also implications for cultural policy. Now, before I start talking about culture, I first need to talk about sheep. There is a reason for that, because the concept of commons is, we don't, when it comes to academic literature, so today I'm focusing on discourse rather than practice. It comes from the management of natural resources, and sheep in particular. So let's go back to 1968 and Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons. We were in the middle of the post-World War II new asset of the world. Cold War is a problem, is a concern that people have. And with also this particular time, there is a rapidly growing global population. And the over-exploitation of natural resources that comes from overpopulation is defined by Hardin as something that is a no technical solution problem, which means that you can't just use science to solve it. Science is not enough. So there are other kinds of solutions that need to be taken into consideration from the perspective of national policies when it comes to this kind of issue. So in order to address this notion of no technical solution problem, Harding goes back to the British Commons, which are these pieces of land, really, that are being co-used by a community as shared land, normally by a community of shepherds for grazing, but also for things like foraging, for things like collecting wood. And the way in which this shared land needs to be managed is with consideration for everybody's needs, for all the needs of the member of a community. Because as Hardin says, if, let's say, a shepherd start introducing more animals to their herd, basically the commons, the grass on the commons, is going to be quickly overexploited and depleted. So the commons will cease to exist in this case. So what is Hardin saying here? Basically, humans can't self-regulate because this is what happened with the British Commons, that it's basically humans cannot protect the common good, that the state needs to intervene in order to find ways for the people to protect the commons. And in particular, Hardin here introduces the notion of state, but also market solution are being contemplated. To that, Elinor Ostrom in 1990 responds to Hardin's article with a series of studies that she carried out in different parts of the world, analyzing common pool shared resources that are being managed by communities all over the world. She has examples of fisheries, of water supplies, so on and so forth. And basically what emerges from her analysis, and this is at the basis of her theory on the commons, is that humans are actually able to self-governate when it comes to the management of finite resources. And basically, in order to do so, they give each other a set of rules that they monitor and they respect together. They have a shared system of values. And they're able to do all of this without the intervention of external forces in a space that exists beyond the market and the state. So this was a fundamental theory that shaped the discourse on the commons and the management of shared resources for the years to come. In this sense, we can see that the interest towards the study of the commons comes from the necessity to analyze how to address big global problems and how to understand the different kinds of logics and rationalities that humans employ when it comes to the management of these resources. And it is essentially about understanding the tension between individualism and collective governance and social relationships. So understanding this balance and how people are able to overcome that and mediate that. So this brings me to speak about software. In the evolution of the commons discourse, we started to find this term being used not only to define the natural resources, but also other kinds of resources such as knowledge. So the knowledge commons become a very important part of the discourse on the commons, and as we'll see, on the cultural commons. Because the term cultural commons was first employed to define knowledge. And in particular, it's interesting to see that in this paper from 1978 by Goldner, the New Class Project. And basically, in Goldner's paper, the culture is being understood not only as, let's say, the arts, as we tend to do very often in policy discussions, but more broadly speaking, it's about creativity for Goldner, scientific knowledge, technical information, so on and so forth. So according to Goldner, this system of knowledge is the human knowledge commons. And Goldner identifies some mechanisms that are commodifying the knowledge commons and also turning them into capital. So these mechanisms, according to Goldner, are things like intellectual property that put some barriers to how people can access information and use it, and also specialized education. So according to Goldner, in this particular period of time, so the late 70s, we can see the rise of the new class, which is a group of people whose power does not rely on the ownership of the means of production, but rather the ownership of cultural capital, the ownership of culture, which became the idea of who has access to knowledge, how do you who gets benefits from knowledge, and how is knowledge commercialized became quite prominent in the following years. And a very important text in this context is Lyotard, The Postmodern Condition, in which he identifies the general theme for the economy of the future, which is knowledge is and will be produced in order to be sold, is and will be consumed in order to be valorized in a new production. In both cases, the goal is exchange. So here the question is, what happens when knowledge, which as we have seen with Goldner is a form of commons, gets commercialized? What happens when knowledge does not fit the standards of capitalist production, but also who owns knowledge, who's got access to it, who regulates, who gets access to knowledge, is a very important question. So in this, it's a useful reminder here that we're speaking the late 70s, beginning of the 80s. So a time in which the idea of creativity and intellectual property and knowledge were extremely important, were in the context of post-Fordist economy that is rising across the global West. So technological advances are changing the way knowledge is produced, it's accessed, and we can think of how things like the commercialization of cultural products was made easier by the technological advancements that happened since the 70s. And also during this time, there is more global attention towards things like intellectual property with international treaties and also individual laws in individual countries addressing intellectual property more closely. So in this context, there are some key stakeholders that are starting to get access to quite a lot of power on knowledge. So these big companies who are interested in building a monopoly on knowledge. And as a result, there is a concern of how this can affect creativity and free speech. And in terms of who these big companies might be, I think you can guess it. So what is the implication for that, for our knowledge commons? So the first comparison between knowledge and the environment when it comes to commons discourse comes from a paper by Boyle, which is Politics of Intellectual Property and Environmentalism for the Net. So Boyle here compares the public domain, so all that set of information that is not being protected by copyright, to the environment as to something that everybody should have access to, that should be kept in a healthy state, and that people have direct benefit from. So in this case, information and is a very broad term because in Boyle's paper, it covers everything from cultural products, but also the human DNA. So Boyle's argument is that currently, so we're thinking about the late 90s here, legislation tends to protect those copyright holders that are the major stakeholders, but tends to fail people who actually are protecting and contributing to the public domain. So researchers, librarians, artists, so on and so forth. And as a result, there was a clear need to think about possible alternatives to existing copyright law in order to create something more flexible and that could better fit the needs of the safety and the health of the public domain. For this reason, a number of law scholars and experts on copyright could design this new tool for the creatives and for the copyright law, which is the Creative Commons license. So we can see the Creative Commons license as something that belongs to the sphere of copyleft. So we can, as an opposite of copyright. But basically, the key idea here was not to completely revolutionize the concept of copyright, nor to deny artists and people who create knowledge the right to benefit from their own creations, but rather the idea here was to find solutions that could allow people to access, use, mix, and extend these creations in a creative way. So this was the logic of the Creative Commons license. However, when it comes to different alternatives to copyright, this wasn't the only one. We can also see during this time and extending into the 2000s, general, more radical approaches, let's say, such as copyright left. Copyright left being a more radical approach to understanding how knowledge should circulate and how people should access it. So this idea of copyright left, and here I'm quoting Anonymous, is based on the idea that intellectual property is fraud. As Nimus says, if property is theft, as Proudhon famously argued, then intellectual property is fraud. It's a meaningless concept. Ideas don't behave like land and cannot be possessed or alienated. Ideas are not original, they're built upon layers of knowledge accumulated throughout history. Out of these common layers, artists create works that have their unmistakable specificities and innovations. All creative works assemble ideas, words, and images from history and the contemporary context. So in this very radical stance, here we can see not only a challenge to the concept of intellectual property, but to creativity itself. Without the cultural commons of the public domain, without the layers of knowledge, artistic expressions that people have contributed to and that have accumulated over the years for people to access, there is no creativity. So this is an interesting way in which during this time, the cultural commons discourse was starting to focus on knowledge, but also on what does it mean to be creative. So the questions that are arising from this new stage of discussion on the commons are: how are knowledge, culture, creativity interrelated, and in what ways are they commons of the humanity? What is the purpose of IP? And how does that apply to things like forms of of collective creativity? And what is fairness when it comes to compensating artists for their contribution to innovation and original thought? But let's pause intellectual property for a moment and the discussions around software and discussion around knowledge, because now we're going to talk about wine. So what happened after this interest towards the cultural commons from the perspective of also creativity and culture? So there were attempts to extend the idea of cultural commons beyond the realm of knowledge and to also start to include practices. A very interesting paper comes from Madison, Frischman, and Strandberg, who define the cultural commons as environments for developing and distributing cultural and scientific knowledge through institutions that support pooling and sharing that knowledge in a managed way. But also situations in which the resources shared by members of a community are cultural resources. So in that paper, these authors, Madison and colleagues, are expanding the cultural commons beyond, what is happening in the realm of intellectual property, but also they're extending that to things like institutions like Associated Press, to the practices of concert goers creating bootleg recordings of their favorite bands, to Wikipedia, so on and so forth. So a very wide range of practices. But this also signals an interest to what is happening, in communities beyond what is being legislated by intellectual property. That article received a reply from Solom shortly after that basically poses this question: what makes a cultural commons a commons? Do all commons share an essential structure or functional construction? If not, what does account for the use of the term commons, which is one of the biggest issues of the study of the cultural commons? Because the idea of commons is an expansive one. It is one that, as Hess said in a 2008 paper, is sometimes being used as a metaphor, because the commons that are being described from the Ostrom perspective, from a new institutional analysis approach, is a very specific kind of governance that, when it comes to the cultural commons, is not always applied that rigidly, due to the nature of culture and to the nature of the ways in which people share idea and create culture together. So an attempt to solve this problem of what is cultural about the cultural commons comes from the work of Sant'Agata and colleagues, and in particular Enrico Bertacchini among these, who defined the cultural commons as a cultural resource shared by a group which can generate one or more social dilemmas. So is defined by the confluence of three dimensions: cultural, space, and community. So we have these three dimensions of the cultural commons that we find. We have a spatial setting that, according to Agatha Bertacchini and colleagues, is not just physical, but also can be digital. We have a community. The Ostrom would have called this a community of appropriators, but because this is a co-constructed commons, the appropriation perhaps is not the best term. And then we have culture, which again is being defined quite extensively in the work of Sant'Agata and colleagues. So Bertacchini and Sant'Agata start this perspective is based on the practices of cultural districts. So these areas where people are creating together, working together to create culture. And this can happen from creative industries perspectives in these cultural districts that are directly related to the creation of cultural products. So I have here a picture of the custard factory in Birmingham, but also cultural districts in which people share ideas, maybe they share values, they share practices. And an example of that comes from the artistic traditions that have developed around the Lake District, for example. And they extend that to quite a wide range of practices. So according to this kind of definition, making Barolo wine in Italy, so going back to wine, is a form of cultural commons because it is a shared set of practices and knowledge that is about a cultural aspect of the communities that live in the area. The artistic movements, so they make the case of Italian futurists here, can be seen as a form of commons in which artists share the best practices and perspectives in a specific place, but also traditions. And here is the cheese rolling event that takes place every year in England. That is an example of that, a tradition, something that people keep alive over time. So quite a wide range of practices. So in this, let's call it chapter of cultural commons discourse, we can see that people basically the study of the cultural commons started to move beyond simply questions of intellectual property and management of intellectual property to start to look at what people are doing and why and how they do that together. So focusing on methods of collaboration and co-production, but also using a very broad understanding of culture, both as arts and I want to say arts and museums and performance, but also as a way of living, which is another way in which we can think about culture. And it's not very easy to identify key characteristics when it comes to this kind of discourse. Sorry about that. And the next chapter that I'd like to talk about is theaters. So why theaters? I would say since the paper by Madison and colleagues, people have started to analyze different kinds of cultural commons, and it is really an area of study that has spread quite widely across different disciplines. We have historical perspectives, urban perspectives. The digital sphere is very rich when it comes to the opportunities for the cultural commoning. The commons have been analyzed both as an artistic practice, but also as a political practice. And also this concept has expanded to embrace, cultural commons is now embracing the environment as well, with the idea of things like landscape. And in particular, the discourse on the cultural commons has turned towards the urban space quite significantly. So in the urban context, especially in Europe, I would say there has been a lot of research on spaces for experimental cultural production that are seen not only as an artist-led space, but actually as a space where the governance of these organizations can extend to everyone, to everybody who's interested, to users, to different kinds of, let's call them stakeholders. And the management of these spaces is achieved through the use of assemblies and also committees and subcommittees that have a wide range of different representatives on. And also in terms of the nature, very often these common practices that are happening in this space are not directly tied to property. In this case, the commons are not a form of property, they are a form of management. Because very often the property of these spaces belongs to somebody else, sometimes the local government, for example. And these spaces and these projects are sometimes co-designed with local authorities, with policymakers and local governments, but also there are some other spaces that organize as in opposition to local councils and national governments and the state. And in particular, this was evident in the practice of occupied abandoned cultural spaces I'm going to talk about in a moment. So, why does that happen? We can look at anti-capitalism to get an answer to that. So, in particular, when it comes to the practice of occupied cultural spaces that have been managed as commons, it comes from the need to reassert the value of culture and cultural work that was engendered by the economic crisis that took place between 2007 and 2008. In my previous work, I have looked at the occupation of cultural spaces in Italy between 2011 and 2014. And these occupations were an opportunity to think about creative work from a different perspective, focusing not so much on to systems of production that were outcome oriented, but actually more process oriented. And very often that this was predicated on equal access to the means of production of artistic work and also to shared governance. And basically to this idea of the embodied ethics of the commons, so on a very relational focus of artistic work and how that happens within different kinds of people in the same space, with an ethics of seeing that not only as a site of political experimentation, but also as economic experimentation, as an alternative way to produce culture. Says commons must guarantee the reproduction of our lives. So this material aspect of the commons, that is also an economic one, was quite prominent in these instances. So in this context, the possibilities of the cultural commons from a policy perspective come from the fact that we can look at things like the management of and the production, the governance, the care and the use of cultural resources, not as something that is as different components that are disjoint from each other, but rather as some different elements of the same process that is based on access to cultural production, horizontal ways to think about decision-making and governance in artistic management, and also in policy making. And one of the examples that I found in my research is the experimentations that have happened in the city of Naples between a commons-based organization called L'Asilo and the local council, who together, through a process that has been documented by Vesco in a series of articles, have found how to collaborate and use a new policy for the city of Naples that guarantees the acknowledgement and that blueprint with other organizations in the city. So from a policy perspective, this is about, I argue it is also about policy making. And yes, so, and why there is also a counter argument that could be easily made, which is about the necessity of the state to recognize the commons or not. And as I was stating, we're talking about the work of Ostrom, the commons exist. So the one who very well from the capitalist and policy perspective, the argument that the commons should not engage at all with policy. They should exist as something not policy method and collaborate with the state. Which I think is something that is an argument that has a lot of value in the how to detain the anti-capitalist and the political power of the cultural commons. But I also want to acknowledge that by finding solutions with policy-making agents and by this kind of collaboration between the government and the commons, there are some productive arenas for development that can be seen as a radical form of new municipalism, perhaps, but that are designed to ensure the sustainability of the commons over time. And also, this is something that Ostrom told us in 1990, that one of the principles that she identifies is the recognition it's something that has been always a problem for the sustainability of the cultural commons. So finding this this shared vision and approach might result in improved sustainability in the cultural commons. Something that I haven't touched in this presentation is the issue of inequalities in the management of cultural commons, and also in more broadly in alternative ways of arts management. That sometimes, there are opportunities to improve access and to improve representation in the governance of culture with the commons model, but the commons are not immune from existing inequalities, existing power relations, and from basically pretty much the same issues that we find in other arenas of the creative industries and in the field of cultural production more broadly. So one of the challenges really to think about how to think of the cultural commons as an inclusive model for the policy making and arts management lies in exactly how do we make this more based on equity, and how do we make sure that we have the representation of different voices, including the ones that are dissenting, which is something that I touched upon in my book more broadly. So some conclusions on this chapter that I have presented today is we can see that the study of the cultural commons are informed by a series of philosophical principles that tend to be quite context specific, depending on the issues that people faced over time, from concerns about intellectual property in the post-Fordist economy to concerns about who's got access to the city, who's got access to culture in more contemporary sets of practices and academic studies. And we can see that as a trend, the cultural commons as a kind of academic discourse has emerged over time as a way to think about possible solutions to counteract neoliberal tendencies and the encroachment of neoliberalism in the cultural space from for example, the issues with intellectual property and big corporations, to what is happening with common spaces in our cities. And so the cultural commons have been looked at as a concept to overcome these new enclosures that are happening in the field of culture. So, and we can see that, so this is not just an apolitical cultural discourse or academic kind of discourse, but actually as theoretical tools to analyze the politics of shared governance and the politics of culture more broadly, and who's got access to it, why, and how can we think about different and further ways to think about culture and policy. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice. This has been wonderful. Thank you so much, Alice. It has been very inspiring listening to this. And I can't wait to read the book as well, which I'm sure is going to have a much more extensive account and details. And thank you as well to Dan and Joseph for giving us the platform for this conversation.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the really rich and interesting discussion. And yeah, thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Dimitra.
Thanks all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.